Welcome back to FreightWaves Now. In this edition of the Research Corner, I'm Tony Mulvey, joined by Joe Antoshak. Joe, how's it going?
Hey, Tony, how you doing? Good to see you.
You know, trying to recover from F3. A lot of interesting stuff came out of F3, right? Had the new product release, or new updated UI for Sonar, and that 4 times faster. But one of the interesting things is Craig Fuller, CEO and founder of FreightWaves, wrote an interesting article yesterday. We're going to break down kind of 2 charts of why we're in a freight recession. Joe, kind of break down what that article was about, and I'll pull up the first chart and kind of walk us through what we're looking at.
Yeah, so this is a look at our outbound tender volume index seasonally, right? So this is looking over the last few years, and you see that white line kind of in the middle there shows where we are currently, and all these other lines are showing you where we were at this time in different years, right? If you look at that spot where the white line ends. So Craig's article was in effect taking us back to the roots of how to understand the U.S. trucking market and where we are currently in it. And it's good to go back to these fundamentals every now and then because it's not always clear. I mean, Tony, to you and I, it's like we're talking about this and we're looking at it every day, so it's kind of old hat. But if you're someone who's new to the industry, it might not make a ton of sense. And so Craig's article broke down how to understand the trucking market as capacity as like one side of the equation, right? And then volume as kind of the other, right? As like this is an indication of demand, right? You got supply and demand. And then he goes on to talk about rejection rates as kind of the primary indicator of the relationship between those two at any point in time. Okay, so a lower rejection rate means a looser market, right? That's worse for carriers. Higher rejection rate, better for carriers, more upward spot rate price pressure. So that's kind of the general gist of it, I would say.
Yeah, and when you look at, freight recession, right? I mean, it just ultimately, I think recession gets thrown around with demand destruction a lot. And in this current environment, yes, we're not at where we were, and we can call that the destruction of demand. But I mean, overall, you look at it, we're higher than where we've been for what, 3 of the last 5 years. So, I mean, relatively, it's not so bad. The difference is we added so much capacity to service the levels of demand that we saw both in that blue and orange line in 2020, 2021, that it feels the demand levels feel a lot lower than they actually are because, like you said, the rejection rate's kind of this combination, it's basically the level, measures supply relative to demand at any point. There's a natural floor where there's going to be imbalances, but you look at it, I mean, we pull it up, we're at 3.6%. You look back to 2019, we're lower than we were at any point in 2019. 2019 was one of the worst years from a carrier perspective, that feeling that they had, because it had a record number of bankruptcies. I think the difference is now, it's not, and what you didn't see in that moment was it really affect freight brokerage. And I think right now you're seeing it affect not just carriers, but you're seeing it affect brokers and carriers. And I think that's what's one of the separations. And then the other is the length of this trough has been a lot longer than what 2019 was, right? We came off 2018, and that trough was relatively short, and COVID helped accelerate it upward. There's nothing right now, and I think that's one of the interesting points, is there's always a catalyst to move the freight industry forward, right? Cause an influx of demand. There doesn't seem like there's one on the horizon right now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And just to your point about volume, right? Our tender volume data being higher now than it was last year, right? Mm-hmm. It's something I've been thinking about a lot because last week we published our Q4 freight sentiment indexes, and the overall freight sentiment metric is lower now than it was in Q4 2022, right? And that's true of carriers too. And I was trying to understand that, like why would that be if volumes are comparable or higher? And presumably, we have had capacity leave the market in 2023. But I think the reality of it is that trough that you're talking about where it's just been so protracted, right? I mean, we've been in like this 3 to 4% range for rejection rates, historic looseness for like much of the year. And that has, I think, really permeated throughout the industry. And it's left carriers feeling like, will this ever end? And it's just a really tough environment, and you kind of see it really clearly with the rejection rates.
I think that's interesting, and I think it's interesting for a fact that last year when we did this, everybody was looking towards the middle of the year to even Q3, Q4, this recovery, and we haven't necessarily seen it. Now, what we have seen is volume levels actually improve sequentially throughout this period of time. So I think that's interesting. And real quick, I mean, just to highlight this imbalance of supply and demand, we've got our carrier details total trucking authorities. This is over the last 5 years, up 48%. Demand levels up 19%. I think this just shows that we've seen the growth in capacity, and we've seen growth in demand, but that capacity has grown exponentially faster than the demand side. But Joe, that's all the time we have for this week's edition of the Research Corner. Thank you so much for joining me. Right now we'll take a quick break, but we'll be back with more Freight Waves Now.